This is the first recording in our discussion of Chapter 9 from American Media History, Radio and Its Promises. The introduction begins with one of the most important and interesting events in American radio history, and that's the broadcast of the War of the Worlds on Halloween Eve in 1938. This was a radio play written and acted by Orson Welles. Radio at the time, of course, was a very important medium for Americans. It was on the eve of war, just a couple of years before World War II, and the war was going in Europe. So Americans were used to depending on radio for news. Listen to the first 15 minutes or so and put yourself in the shoes of someone in 1938. Can you see why some, at least, might have panicked? As we go through the chapter, we'll discuss 6 phases of development. In terms of the recordings, the phases are not at all equal, so I'll combine some of them. However, this first phase is quite long, and so we'll get started right away. Scientific achievements and the communication giants. So, unlike previous media, except to some degree film, radio was developed from many isolated scientific and technological achievements that eventually had to be tied together by various people. The 4 inventions were telegraphy, electricity, telephony, and wireless telegraphy. So telegraphy, this was the electromagnetic telegraph developed by Samuel Morse in 1835. He used a series of dots and dashes that became known as Morse code, and it is not an exaggeration to say this revolutionized communication, because for the first time there was a separation between communication and distance, or communication and transportation. Up until this time, if you wanted to communicate with someone far away, you had to have it sent. Somebody had to deliver it, whether it was a pigeon, a pony, or a person running. Now there was an automatic way to send information over many miles. The first line was between Baltimore and New York, and that opened in May 1944 with the words, "What hath God wrought?" Indeed, Morse code changed everything. If we had done the chapter on the Civil War, you would have seen how absolutely essential telegraphy was for that. Next was electricity, and we're back with Thomas Edison. We saw a lot of Thomas Edison in the last chapter with respect to film. As you know, he built a new laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, and he applied for as many as 400 patents per year. I believe I told you that his favorite was the phonograph, and the first recorded words ever were "Mary had a little lamb." But perhaps, the most important, if you consider the influence on human history, might have been the light bulb, the electric light. So his interest was to make it so that many electric lights could be illuminated at the same time. So he partnered with the Vanderbilts and J.P. Morgan to establish the Edison Electric Light Company, which put in the first electric power station in Manhattan. This later became the General Electric Company. Telephony was next. Alexander Graham Bell, as you know, was the inventor of the telephone. He was interested in working with deaf people. And in 1876, he connected telephone lines between New York and Boston. So the first long-distance voice over wire communication took place. By 1878, 21 people were connected by telephone lines, and this established the Bell Telephone Company. He spent years trying to perfect the telephone and spent a lot of time fighting patent battles. He applied for the patent just literally hours before his main competitor, Elisha Gray, did. And so the two of them spent a lot of time in patent battles, and we'll see that that's actually not an uncommon thing when it comes to the invention of technology for radio and for television. Now, wireless telegraphy. This is where we get to be a little complicated. The inventions were taking place all over Europe and the United States. So let's start with James Clerk Maxwell, who was a Scot, who theorized that energy passed through space as waves traveling at the speed of light, and messages similar to those using telegraph wires could be sent without wires. Okay, this was revolutionary, and he called it the electromagnetic radio waves. Heinrich Hertz demonstrated the first transmission and reception of radio waves. And because of this, his name, megahertz, is the measure of all radio frequencies. This was in 1887. In the United States, Nathan Stubblefield in Kentucky was also experimenting with talking at distances. And in 1902, he sent a wireless voice message. At the same time, Guglielmo Marconi, who was a non-scientist, sent Morse code wirelessly over 2 miles from his home in Italy. So it was a Morse-coded message. It wasn't voice, as Stubblefield had done in Kentucky. His family was so impressed that they took him to the Italian government, but they weren't interested. So Marconi went to Britain. By 1897, he had investors and established British Marconi. 2 years later, a U.S. subsidiary, American Marconi, was established, and it became the dominant marine and transatlantic company until World War II, American Marconi. Reginald Fessenden had a theory of continuous wave, a means of superimposing sound onto radio waves. So in December of 1900, he transmitted his own voice over 1 mile, and thus radio broadcasting was born. On Christmas Eve of 1906, those out in ships on the Atlantic heard his wife playing the violin and singing Christmas carols, and this was the first radio broadcast. Interestingly, he couldn't market himself as well as people like Edison and Marconi, and so his patents were seized, and he actually died a forgotten man. And part of this was that his backers, the investors, couldn't envision voice for radio for anything other than ships, person-to-person communication. So ships found it invaluable, but nobody really had a vision at this time for radio as a broadcast one-way medium. Wireless telegraphy became essential after the Titanic accident in 1912. Radio operators on the Titanic ignored the warnings that icebergs were ahead, and of course they were carrying some of the most wealthy individuals in the United States and Europe across the Atlantic, and so they cleared the airwaves so that these wealthy passengers could send messages between Britain and Europe. There were other ships that were closer than the one that actually ended up saving some of the Titanic passengers. That was the Carpathia. It was farther away than other ships, but those other ships had radios, but they were turned off and their operators were asleep. So we know from this that over 1,500 people died in this tragedy, and it's the beginning of the career of one of the most influential men in all of radio, television, broadcast history, and this is David Sarnoff, a name that you'll hear a lot. There's a sort of an urban legend, I think probably it's at least to some degree true. Sarnoff was interested from a young age in the telegraph, and so he went to New York and tried to learn how to use the telegraph. He found a mentor who did that. He went to work for American Marconi and set up in Wanamaker's department store in Manhattan a display of radio. Well, as soon as he did this, the story of the Titanic started coming through. And it is said that for 72 hours, he alone broadcast the entire tragic stories. He made contact with the Carpathia, and he told people who the survivors were as soon as he got that information from the Carpathia. The president required that all other radio communication be cut off so that nothing would interrupt the broadcast and the communication that Sarnoff was having with the Carpathia. Naturally, the radio itself came to be seen as something of a a miraculous thing for the public. Wanamaker's department store, American Marconi, and David Sarnoff became legends as a result of this, the Titanic. For those of us who are interested in the history of the regulation of American media, the Titanic brought about the first regulation, the 1912 U.S. Wireless Ship Act, that required radios and operators to be awake on ships with over 50 people. And so they had to be attended 24 hours a day. This is significant because it really is the first time the U.S. government began to regulate any media. They never regulated newspapers, they never regulated magazines, any print media. But now we have an electronic media that people can and people can see that it has all kinds of potential benefits. So we begin what again is a long history of battles about regulation of broadcast media. A couple of other important people that added some crucial technology as radio was developed. One was Lee DeForest, and his goal was to bring opera into the home. So he developed something called the Audion tube, which amplified the airwaves. So it wasn't that it was, that he was sending messages, is that it was louder. And so this became essential for thinking about radio as a mass medium. And he was the first one who did this. He saw it as not just point to point. The idea was rejected by Marconi. Edwin H. Armstrong was working on the same type of technology at the same time, and he and Lee DeForest became involved again in a patent war that lasted 20 years. DeForest won the patent. Edwin Armstrong committed suicide. He was so upset about this decision. So these were essential forms of technology that were needed to grow radio as a mass medium. Real quickly, the rise of the communication giants. Before World War I, the public didn't embrace radio, and most experts didn't see it as anything other than a gadget and no threat to conventional telegraphy. Early on, shortly after the Titanic event, Marconi had a vision of radio as a radio music box, but when he took it to the vice president of Marconi, he was just listened to and sent away. Nobody could share his vision. During World War I, the federal government took over all of radio inventions to be used for the war effort. And so it allowed companies to, competing companies, to manufacture all different types of technology without worrying about infringing on each other's patents. After the war, many wanted the government to keep the patent rights and control radio completely, but there was a lot of outcry from ham operators, so private amateur radio operators, and so the government sent the patents back to the companies that owned them to begin with. All the necessary patents were held by competing companies, so an organization came together called the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, and this, Owen Young, the general counsel at GE, laid out a plan to determine how these competing companies would contribute to the growth of radio. The companies were General Electric, Westinghouse, the United Fruit Company, AT&T, and RCA. You don't need to know all the details here, but what's important is that RCA divided up the technologies among these companies so that GE and Westinghouse, they were allowed to manufacture receivers which the Radio Corporation of America would sell. AT&T was given telephone, and Westinghouse and, Western Electric and AT&T pooled their patents as well for telephones. So this brings us to the end of sort of the technology that was needed and the corporate structure that was put in place for radio.